In 1969, Simon and Garfunkel were the biggest duo on Earth. But while one was alone in a dark studio, the other was 2,000 miles away filming a movie, a 6-week trip that would permanently shatter a 17-year friendship. They had just defined an entire generation with the soundtrack for The Graduate, and they were in the early, agonizing stages of producing what would become the absolute pinnacle of their commercial and critical career, Bridge Over Troubled Water. From the outside looking in, the public saw two inseparable artists, childhood best friends, whose voices intertwined so perfectly it was often impossible to tell where one harmony ended and the other began. But behind the pristine vocal blends and the staggering record-breaking sales figures, a deeply toxic, suffocating dynamic was quietly festering. This was not a sudden explosion of anger. It was a slow, agonizing divorce, playing out over reel-to-reel tape machines, expensive long-distance phone calls, and unspoken resentments.
Let me take you inside the exact granular moments where the ultimate musical success story completely unraveled, proving that sometimes achieving everything you ever wanted is the exact catalyst for losing the only thing that actually mattered. To truly understand the magnitude of this collapse, you have to understand the bedrock of their foundation. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel did not just meet as fully formed adults at an industry mixer or in the sterile lobby of a major record label. They had known each other intimately since they were 11 years old, growing up side by side in the neighborhood of Kew Gardens Hills in Queens, New York. They learned to sing together, breathe together, and harmonize in a way that literally reshaped the landscape of popular music. When you listen to the isolated vocal tracks of their earliest breakthrough hits, you are not hearing two separate singers. You are hearing two voices acting as a single, highly evolved, unified organism. But by the late 1960s, that organism was tearing itself apart from the inside out. The music industry machinery absolutely loves to sell consumers the heartwarming narrative of the perfect creative marriage. We see it constantly with legendary songwriting pairs, this romanticized idea that transcendent genius requires a completely unified, conflict-free front. But the unspoken, ugly truth of the creative economy is that extreme proximity, eventually and inevitably, breeds intense paranoia. As their fame skyrocketed to unimaginable heights, a silent, bitter tally was being kept in the background. Paul was the relentless architect of the operation. He was the primary songwriter who spent agonizing, sleepless hours perfecting every single lyric, agonizing over complex chord progressions, and managing the grueling studio arrangements. Art, on the other hand, was the angelic instrument. He was the charismatic frontman with a once-in-a-generation tenor voice who arguably captured the lion's share of the public's adoration and the breathless media attention without having to bleed over a legal pad at 3 in the morning. This severe imbalance in raw labor versus public glory was a ticking time bomb, deeply embedded into the fabric of their daily interactions, and all it needed was a single, significant spark to detonate. That catastrophic spark arrived heavily disguised as a tremendous Hollywood opportunity. Director Mike Nichols, the visionary filmmaker who had famously catapulted the duo into the absolute stratosphere by heavily featuring their music in his cultural touchstone film The Graduate, was gearing up to shoot his next massive project. It was an incredibly ambitious, big-budget adaptation of Joseph Heller's iconic, sprawling anti-war novel, Catch-22. Nichols, riding high on his recent Oscar win, wanted both musicians heavily involved in the movie. He cast Art Garfunkel in the highly significant dramatic role of Captain Nately, and he initially wrote a secondary part specifically for Paul Simon to play the character of Dunbar. At first glance, this seemed like the logical, perfect next step for the biggest pop act in the world to conquer a new medium together. But then the script went through a massive revision process. When the dust settled, Paul's character was entirely unceremoniously written out of the film. Art's character, however, remained a crucial emotional pillar of the story. Paul was essentially told his services were simply not required on set.
leaving him discarded and left behind in New York to shoulder the massive burden of recording their highly anticipated fifth studio album alone. This creates our first crucial point of catastrophic fracture, fundamentally rooted in the massive divergence of labor and glory. First, Paul was left completely isolated to shoulder the absolute entirety of the creative burden for their music. He was sequestered in a windowless studio, meticulously layering acoustic guitars, directing session musicians, and experimenting with complex polyrhythms, while his partner was getting paid handsomely to play a glamorous movie star on a dusty, sun-drenched film set. Second, the fundamental power dynamic of their entire relationship violently shifted overnight. Up until this exact point in their shared history, Paul controlled the music, which inherently meant he controlled the trajectory of their shared career. By stepping onto a massive Hollywood set under the direction of an Oscar-winning filmmaker, Art was suddenly achieving a massive, undeniable level of independent, mainstream validation that had absolutely nothing to do with Paul's songwriting genius. Third, there was the sheer geographical and emotional isolation to consider. The physical distance of over 2,000 miles physically manifested the massive emotional chasm that had been growing between them for years. Paul wasn't just working alone in a vocal booth. He was agonizing in real time over the devastating fact that his partner was not only surviving without him, but actively thriving in a completely separate industry. The original production plan was for Art to be on location in Guaymas, Mexico for just a relatively short period. The film schedule was supposed to be tight and efficient, allowing him to return to New York quickly to finish laying down the complex vocal harmony tracks for the record. But massive Hollywood movie productions, especially sprawling wartime epics shot in remote, unforgiving locations involving vintage aircraft and hundreds of extras, are notorious for unpredictable logistical nightmares. The production of Catch-22 dragged on far beyond anyone's initial estimates, and then it dragged on some more. Art's crucial return to the recording studio was delayed by a staggering relationship-ending 6 extra weeks. Now, a purely logical, conventional perspective might suggest that Paul could have simply used this unexpected quiet time productively, enjoying the peaceful isolation to refine his masterpieces without argument or compromise. But human psychology, especially within a deeply intertwined 17-year artistic marriage, absolutely does not operate on logic. It operates almost exclusively on deeply ingrained insecurities and perceived slights. The counterintuitive reality of this situation is that Paul's forced isolation rapidly mutated into a toxic echo chamber for his deepest, darkest fears of abandonment. He wasn't just a producer waiting for a singer to arrive for a vocal session. He was a terrified childhood friend waiting for a brother who suddenly seemed entirely indifferent to the massive musical empire they had painstakingly built together. Paul began to view every single day Art spent in the Mexican desert not as an unavoidable Hollywood scheduling conflict, but as a profound, deliberate betrayal. Every delayed flight and extended shoot was interpreted by Paul as a loud, undeniable declaration that the music they made was completely secondary to the allure of Hollywood glamour. Conversely, if you force yourself to look at the situation from Art's isolated perspective, you see a completely different, equally valid emotional reality. For the first time in his adult life, Art was finally breaking free from the incredibly suffocating, overbearing control of a notoriously perfectionist partner. Back in the New York recording studio, Paul ruthlessly dictated every single breath, every nuanced phrasing, and every minute harmony adjustment. Down in Mexico, Art was a respected, independent artistic entity, sharing the screen and receiving validation from legendary heavyweight actors like Orson Welles, Martin Balsam, and Alan Arkin. The ultimate tragedy here is the absolute, catastrophic failure of mutual empathy. Neither man possessed the emotional vocabulary to see the other's internal pain.
Paul looked south and saw an ungrateful, narcissistic partner abandoning the difficult labor. Art looked north and saw a deeply controlling, jealous tyrant who simply couldn't handle his partner finding a shred of individual success outside their incredibly insular, codependent bubble. This intense, silent psychological warfare wasn't just confined to private, passive-aggressive arguments or terse phone calls. It was permanently, beautifully etched into the master magnetic tapes of the album itself. When you want to truly analyze the staggering technical brilliance that can be born directly from this specific brand of deep resentment, you only need to look at the anatomy of the track "The Only Living Boy in New York." Paul Simon essentially wrote a gorgeous, heartbreaking musical diary entry detailing this exact excruciating period of abandonment. He literally opens the song with the direct line, "Tom, get your plane right on time." This isn't just a random poetic name chosen for a rhyme scheme. When Paul and Art first started writing and performing together as ambitious teenagers in the 1950s, their original stage name was Tom and Jerry. Art Garfunkel was Tom Graff, and Paul Simon was Jerry Landis. By deliberately invoking the name Tom in the opening breath of the song, Paul is intentionally bypassing the massive, impenetrable global superstar entity known as Simon and Garfunkel, and he is directly, desperately addressing the 11-year-old boy from Queens. He is stripping away the fame, the money, and the accolades, and pleading with his oldest friend in the world to simply come back home. Technically speaking, the production of this song is an absolute masterclass in utilizing physical studio space to vividly convey internal emotional devastation. Because Art was missing, Paul was forced to record the sweeping backing vocals alone. He placed himself inside a massive, reverberating echo chamber to perfectly simulate the vast, incredibly empty feeling of being entirely alone in a massive metropolis while the person you need most is thousands of miles away. He painstakingly, repeatedly layered his own voice over and over again on the multi-track recorder, creating a breathtaking, sweeping chorus that ironically sounds exactly like a massive, unified choir of angels. Yet this massive wall of sound was constructed entirely by a deeply isolated, solitary man sitting alone in a dark, quiet booth. If you want a literal, actionable lesson in how to turn severe emotional distress into incredibly high-value, timeless artistic output, this specific recording session is the ultimate historical blueprint. Paul didn't react by writing an angry, bitter, up-tempo diatribe to attack his partner. Instead, he took the highly specific, incredibly granular details of his frustration, the literal airplane flights, the dusty Mexican location, the crippling feeling of exactly half of your creative soul being absent, and he brilliantly transmuted those details into a universally resonant, soaring melody about the crushing weight of urban loneliness. He essentially weaponized his own feeling of abandonment to create a masterpiece that his absent partner would eventually have to sing. We see this exact destructive success-to-ruin dynamic play out constantly across dozens of different high-stakes modern industries, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Simon and Garfunkel fracture is not just a music history footnote, but a universal psychological blueprint for partnership collapse. Consider the modern technology sector, where ambitious co-founders often start their journey in a deeply unified, collaborative garage environment, much like two unknown kids harmonizing in a cramped basement. When the tech company inevitably explodes in multi-billion-dollar valuation, one founder almost always transitions into the highly visible, charismatic, public-facing chief executive, while the other remains the unseen, underappreciated technical architect, relentlessly grinding away in the quiet background. The hidden architect inevitably builds a massive, toxic reservoir of resentment, feeling deeply that their raw, unglamorous labor is solely funding the other person's magazine covers and celebrity status. We saw it explicitly with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, where the massive divergence of public glory versus private, obsessive engineering created a permanent, unbridgeable rift in their relationship. We even see it constantly in the modern digital content creation space, where charismatic channel hosts gain millions of adoring fans and lucrative brand deals, while the brilliant, overworked editors, thumbnail artists, and back-end retention strategists feel entirely uncredited, invisible, and ultimately disposable.
The Catch-22 script delay didn't just casually break up a successful pop band. It violently highlighted the fatal, unavoidable flaw in literally any collaborative enterprise, where the daily distribution of hard labor permanently misaligns with the public distribution of global recognition. By the time Art Garfunkel finally wrapped production in Mexico and returned to the recording studio in New York, the underlying emotional damage was completely irreversible. They managed to professionally push through the agonizing tension, completely finished recording Bridge Over Troubled Water, and released it to massive, unprecedented critical and commercial acclaim. The album shattered global sales records, effortlessly swept the Grammy Awards, completely dominated the cultural zeitgeist, and then, at the absolute peak of their combined power, they promptly walked away from each other. A deeply profound 17-year bond, forged in the innocence of childhood, and subsequently tested by the absolute extreme limits of unprecedented global fame, was ultimately shattered by an unpredictable movie shooting schedule and a deep-seated silent battle over creative ego and psychological control. It definitively proves that the single greatest existential threat to a legendary, history-making partnership isn't failure, bankruptcy, or public rejection, but rather the highly asymmetrical, deeply isolating nature of extreme, unbridled success. But what exactly happens when the exact opposite scenario occurs? What happens when a legendary band absolutely, fundamentally despises each other, yet is legally and contractually forced by their massive record label to live isolated in the exact same house for an entire year to record a make-or-break album? That specific, intense level of psychological torture actually created the single best-selling record of the 1970s, and it's a terrifying story of acoustic warfare and romantic betrayal that you absolutely have to hear to believe.